Good afternoon or early good evening, everyone. Shavua Tov, and welcome to tonight's book talk and conversation, the state of our democracy now in November and beyond. I'm really thrilled to have three terrific thinkers with us tonight to dig into this moment in our democracy and think about ways to move forward and how we can maybe make a difference in what's going on. As many of you know, David Litt grew up at BJ, and I also connect with him as an alumni of Yale. I'm Colin Wild, by the way. Sorry, I'm the executive director of BJ, and I am the co-founder of the Yale Jewish Alumni Association. And as both groups are very proud to co-present tonight's program. David is the New York Times bestselling author of Thanks Obama, My Hopi Changey White House Years. And from 2011 to 16, David wrote speeches for President Obama and was described as the comic muse for the president for his work on the White House Correspondents' Dinner. Since leaving the White House, he served as the head writer and producer of Funny or Die's office in Washington, with a focus on improving youth turnout in the 2018 election, and is currently developing a sitcom based on his life in DC. He frequently appears on CNN and MSNBC to discuss current events. David's book, Democracy in One Book or Less, is available for pre-order, and all pre-order proceeds will support Run for Something. And at the end of the program, I'll share some links where you can pre-order the book. And that was the impetus for getting tonight's discussion going, though we're certainly going to talk about broader issues that we're facing tonight. Amie Parnes is the senior political correspondent for The Hill newspaper in Washington, and she also co-authored the #1 New York Times bestseller, Shattered, Inside Hillary Clinton's Doomed Campaign, and the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, HRC, State Secrets and the Rebirth of Hillary Clinton. Parnes covered Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign, the Obama White House, and currently covers national politics. And Amie is also already working on a book about the 2020 presidential election, which will come out after said election, assuming it happens, which will come out from Crown Publishing. Ginna Green was, until very recently, the chief strategy officer at Bend the Arc and is now a board member of Bend the Arc. She is a political strategist, writer, and consultant. At Bend the Arc, she led work on communications, advocacy, electoral and rapid response, and racial equity teams. A period of unprecedented white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and authoritarianism in American life. Prior to Bend the Arc, Ginna was managing director of the Democracy Collaborative at Rethink Media, where she strengthened communications capacity of the groups working on money and politics, fair and diverse courts, and voting rights. Ginna is a frequent speaker and writer on democracy, race, and racism in the Jewish community diversity, and leadership, and has been published in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, Salon, and more. Ginna sits on the boards of Women's March, Political Research Associates, and the Jews of Color Initiative, and is a 2019 Schusterman Fellow. And Ginna is also a native Southerner and the mother of 4 amazing kids. With that, I welcome folks tonight. We're so glad you're with us, and I'm going to hand it over to David, Ginna, and Amie.
Well, thank you. I don't know, can everybody, can you hear us? Can we be heard? I think, all right, we'll get started. Amie, I don't know, I feel like you're the reporter, so I will let you start with the questions. I just want to say thank you to BJ and the Yale alums in New York, or the Yale Jewish alums, for having me. And, hi to everybody, both the people who I'm related to and also the people who I'm not related to. It's nice to, well, not see you all, but it's nice to be here with you, virtually speaking. So Amie, I don't know if you want to kick things off with a question.
Sure. Well, thank you guys all for being here. I'm a big fan of David Litt's, as I'm sure you guys all are. I think that I read the book. I read this book with my mom in quarantine, if I'm being honest, and we laughed a lot together, and we found it really insightful. And so I wanted to, what a moment for us to have this conversation, and I'm glad Ginna's on board too. Can you talk to us a bit about how you started writing this book? And did you ever envision, as you were starting to write this book, that we would be in this moment right now? And what does this moment mean in terms of, here's your book and here we are, and tell us about where we are right now as a country.
So I'll start with the second part of your question first, Amie. I did not think that we would be in this moment right now. I mean, if I had written a book about here's how we deal with a pandemic on one hand and a historic but also fraught with peril moment of unrest on the other, I think that would have been very timely, but I didn't see those things coming. I did have this moment in 2017, and I remember this very clearly on Inauguration Day. I went to Disney World with my wife, Jackie, who I'm sure some of you watching, you know her and have met her. It was her birthday falls on Inauguration Day every 4 years. And so we did not want to be where the inauguration would be on TV. But as this was happening, I remember sort of watching things on my phone and seeing the news and having this moment of not just realizing that there was a president being inaugurated who a majority of Americans had voted for someone else. We all know about the Electoral College, but realizing that this seemed like the tip of the iceberg, that in general, we were locked in this pattern of over and over and over again, Americans wanted one thing from their government, and despite the fact that we're a democracy, we were getting the opposite. And when I worked in the Obama White House, in some cases that was true, and then even in cases when we had the power to make change, it was so much harder than it should have been. So much harder, certainly, than Schoolhouse Rock taught me it was supposed to be. And so, I was never a particularly good student. It's one of the reasons I became a speechwriter, so that I could know a little bit about a lot of things. But I started really digging into these issues. And, we can talk more about how what's going on right now in all sorts of ways, speaks to those issues or vice versa. But I would say the biggest thing that I learned is that our democracy has really just fundamentally changed within my lifetime alone. And in almost every case, it's gotten less representative. And in almost every case, the people most targeted by those changes are exactly the same people who are most likely to be victims of police brutality, who are most likely to be out in the streets today. And so I think what we are seeing is this inflection point, and hopefully not a breaking point, where we have to decide, are we going to really reckon with our history? And are we going to think about the ways that racism and really small d democratic tendencies are embedded in our democracy and do something about it and fix the system? Or are we going to let those flaws and those original sins destroy us? And are we going to end up slipping over the edge into authoritarianism, which a lot of other countries have done? So I think that's the moment that we're in. And for all that, there are so many things about what's happening right now that I would never claim to understand. But I think knowing that and understanding our history and our present is really helpful.
Ginna, we'd love your take.
Yeah, wow. So first, thanks Colin, David, Amie for inviting me to be in this conversation. BJ, it's great to see some of your faces I actually remember from being in y'all's community a couple times over the last year. A few things quickly. I think, David, you mentioned this moment, and what's interesting to me is so many of us have been saying this moment for the last 5 years, right? Since the Trump ascendancy, this moment that we're in, and that moment changes. And in the last 10 days, the moment has even changed even more dramatically. And in the last 48 hours, it has changed, because what we have now seen is that real transformative change actually can be possible. And so when you were talking about, David, just now, hopefully we're not at our breaking point. We're not at our breaking point, but I think that we can see all the cracks that have been on display in the foundation of America. It's not broken yet, but we're actually taking the time. And what's been so gratifying to me in this moment is the number of white people and white Jews who have reached out to me and who have said, I now see something different. There is a new vision that has appeared before folks. And we actually are beginning to do that reckoning with our original sin that you mentioned, David, which feels palpable and which is what sort of has me vacillating between deep despair at times and the most hope I've had in a long time. I remember in 2016 on election day, I took my 13-year-old son to canvass in Charlotte for Hillary. And to be honest, that was one of the most demoralizing days of a parent that I think I've had. We were on our feet all day and we were just bombarded with division And, everything that we knew that marked the 2016 campaign, we saw firsthand. And that night, as election results were coming in, my son, who was going to be going to high school in the next year, he was like, Mom, I want to go away. I want to go away to yeshiva. I want to have a Jewish education and a secular education. That's what I want to do. We were in the process of looking at places and figuring it out. And when I saw what would be our reality, I had to tell him that night, I can't send my Black Jewish child away in this climate. I knew then that the moment was going to come. And so it's incredibly, there's something about where we are right now, almost 4 years later, that feels like we are about to make a new country. And so I'm really excited to be able to have this conversation on this topic with this group today.
I'm curious about what has made you both, David and Ginna, what has made you most hopeful? What have you seen in the last week or 2 weeks that show you that this is happening, that this is the moment? And we heard President Obama talk about that this week. What has given you the most light in all of this and the most hope?
I think we had this remarkable, and I feel like, Ginna, you talked about how we've been saying this moment for 5 years. I feel like there's all sorts of euphemisms that we used during the Trump era, right? So when I say remarkable, I don't just mean, I don't mean remarkably good. We had this remarkable moment on Tuesday when, I think it was Tuesday, when the protesters were at the White House and the administration cleared them with tear gas. And I will say this has also been such a strange experience, because a lot of these places, right, that was my commute for so many years. And it's a place that I associate, not just as a Democrat or someone who worked for Obama, but as an American. The idea that I could walk into that building, and the idea of thinking about, and I think this is true for a lot of people in this community, where I come from, 4 or 5 generations ago. And then you get, not that long in historical terms, and I can walk into a place like that. And so to see almost the opposite of that, this not just keeping people out, but literally driving people away by force, the kind of thing we would expect to see maybe in another country, but not here. I think that felt to me like an inflection point. And there was this question of, how is America going to respond? Do we want to really be a democracy? And I think there's all these democratic institutions, but there's this fundamental question of, do we want to let people who we don't agree with all the time have their say, or do we want something else? And I have to say, what's made me really hopeful is if you look at the people in the streets, but also just ordinary Americans who are getting polled, what do they think? People are saying, we don't like this. We don't like the division. We would rather live in a country where people can disagree respectfully than in a country where only some views are allowed, where the power is only held by people who don't want it, by people who, we want to have it. And the other thing that I've learned, and what I keep coming back to, and I come back to for years now researching, is on most of these issues, Americans want everybody to be heard. They want fair elections. They want high turnout at polling places. They want people to not have to wait in line for hours upon hours to vote. These are not Republican issues or Democratic issues. These are values that Americans still have, even at a moment when it feels like democracy is in peril. So those are some of the things that give me hope right now.
I would actually agree with that moment in time last Tuesday, because as you said, David, that was an authoritarian tactic, like straight out of the authoritarian's playbook, right? Like that is what it was. And I think what I keep thinking about in my mind is that America's democracy, like we're not the only game in town, but we're the longest running show in town, right? And one of the things that I learned in 2016, I was talking to a friend of mine, I was living in South Carolina at the time, and she said something to me. It was a very polarized community. Columbia, Richland County it's a blue county amidst a sea of red. And she said, to your point, David, about what most Americans want, she said, I feel like we all agree on where we need to go. We just disagree on how to get there. And I think that there is some truth, because I actually do believe that there is a difference in how to get there. And I actually do believe that there's a difference in where we want to go. Some of us want to go and have a democracy that works, and then there are people as we've seen, who don't. And so that is sort of like the fight that we're in right now of most of the country versus a small minority of the country, which is harder based on what you lifted up in this book, David. Like, who is the electorate? Who is America? They're not the same people. And I think that, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that, because that portion of the book for me was some of the most like compelling and interesting pieces about like, who is making decisions? Who are we? And are we all who we vote? Or, you know what I mean? Like, that's like a real question.
Well, I guess if you want me to talk more about the book, I'll do it if you insist. But I think that is a really important question right now. I mean, I will say, because these questions of culture and our values and the structure of our government, they're tied together. I remember right after Trump won, there was an Obama alumni kind of a gathering, and it was current and former White House staff. And one of my former bosses and mentors, Mike Stratmanis, said, the next 4 years are going to be about this question of who gets to be American. And he was exactly right. And so one of the things that I started to look at was this question of who gets to vote, because to a very large extent, people who vote matter in a democracy in a way people who do not vote do not matter. And what I found was remarkable is you had Ben Franklin saying something, he said it a little bit more eloquently than I did, but he said basically the same thing in 1774. Before we even had a country, there was this idea that if you don't vote, your preferences, your opinions don't really matter. You don't really have power. And if you look at one of the biggest changes that has happened in our country over the last 40 years, the number of people in America who either don't have voting rights at all, or who have voting rights in theory but can't exercise those voting rights for some reason, has gone so much bigger. It's so much bigger than it used to be. And that's a real change. I mean, the history I always learned of American voting was more and more people got to vote over time. And for most of my life, when I was a kid, that was still true. And then sometime around like when I was maybe 18 or 15 to 18, that was around the time when in American history, those numbers started to go way down. And so the system we have now, unfortunately, is a place where you think that politicians should try to win elections by winning over voters who don't agree with them. But in too many cases, you can win elections by making sure the people who don't agree with you can't vote. And that's one of the things we have to fix as a country if we're going to move in the right direction.
So how do we do that?
Okay, well, fair question. So I will say, here's a chance to I feel like I'm always supposed to show the book cover. So I did very intentionally. Here's the book cover. It's very fancy.
I can show mine too, David. It's got my Post-it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Post-its. I like it. I feel like the thing with these is always like, if people have read the book, that's always like so exciting for an author. Amie, I'm sure you've had the same experience. And so I'm like over the moon right now, being like, oh, you guys both clearly have read the book. And, and for me, one of the things that was important to me was to talk about it in the title, in the subtitle, why fixing it is easier than you think. So when it comes to voting rights in particular, one of the most important things to understand about voting rights is a lot of this can actually be done with just one single federal law, like that old Schoolhouse Rock model of a bill that wants to become a law and it goes through committee and then it gets signed by a president. We could make voter registration automatic by doing that. We could get rid of voter purges that are taking all of these eligible voters off the rolls with just one law. We could, if we wanted to, move election day to a Sunday, or we could make election day a holiday. We could also, by the way, this is a really important and underappreciated thing. We could make it so that we had more poll workers, right? We could hire more poll workers and pay them more, because we have a poll worker shortage in this country. That means that, generally speaking, on average, Black and brown voters are waiting much longer to vote than white voters wait. So we could do all of these things, and it could literally happen January 21st, 2021, if there is a majority in Congress and a president who would like to do those things. So in many cases, a lot of this stuff is hard, but it's not impossible. I mean, we look at all of the things that have happened and we think maybe our institutions just aren't up to the job. That could happen if we're not careful. But for now, there's so much change we can do so quickly.
I think
David,
sorry, go ahead.
No, we'd love to hear from you on that too.
I was actually going to ask another question, or like just bring another element to it. One of my former colleagues used to remind me that we don't have, in this country, we don't have one national election, we have 50 state elections. And so even though there is a lot that can be done at the federal level, and we also know that states have taken tremendous authority, look at a state like Minnesota, which has, I think, the highest voting rate in the country. They've got good laws, right? And so like I think it's important to think about what the federal government can do as a floor, because states can always do better and more in addition to some of that work too.
I think that's exactly right. And I would say, one of the things that I found, and I kind of came into writing this book saying, I don't want to be the person that grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and then went to, college at Yale and New Haven, and then, has lived the last 10 years in DC and talks about how there's all these problems in Southern states. But the more I looked into it, I mean, we have a legacy of not just, we think about, obviously, Jim Crow as this racist legacy, but it is also a legacy of authoritarianism. So there was a playbook for how you keep people from voting that was tailor-made, and has mostly been used against non-white voters, but can just as easily be applied against young voters or people who rent instead of own their homes, all sorts of different marginalized groups. So local elections matter so much. I think that's one of the other things, Amie, that makes me so hopeful about this moment, is that people are realizing how much local elections matter. And I would say not just in red states and not just in purple states. Like New York State is beginning to improve, but has some of the worst election laws in the country. Anyone who's voted in New York State knows, and I'm sure if you're watching this, elections in New York are a mess, and they do not have to be a mess. And actually it's a huge problem, because a lot of the time, for example, when in North Carolina, they got sued over some of their laws specifically designed to keep non-white voters from voting. Clearly that was the intention, but they turned around and said, hey, look, New York is a blue state. They're doing that. So, what we're doing is pretty standard. So actually New York, for example, setting the bar so low affects other states as well. So I would say if you're in New York and you want to make a difference, caring about local election laws, even though New York is a solidly blue state, that's really important.
I have to ask you, you wrote in the book that, and we hear from time to time, always, those of us in politics, good policy is good politics. Protesters, I think yesterday, wrote defund the police next to the Black Lives Matter, the huge street symbol right now that Mayor Bowser had put in, a very powerful statement just a block or so from the White House. What do you mean by that? Can you kind of explain to folks what you mean by good policy is good politics, and how does that pertain to right now? Are we going to see people asking to defund the police, and how did Democrats square that? How do you square that? And I'll stop there. I've thrown a lot at you.
Yeah, I feel like this is the kind of question I would really rather dodge, but I have to be part of this, so I can't do that. So here's what I would say, and Ginna, I'm curious what you think about this as well. I guess my answer to that would be, first of all, I used to hear that good policy is good politics, and I think it was kind of said as like a throw pillow motto, right? Like if you do the right thing, that'll work out. And I tended to hear it from people who I admire a lot, but who were a generation or more older than I am. I think that the idea that good policy is good politics is aspirational rather than a statement of fact. So what you want out of your democracy, if we were sitting down and we were just saying, all right, the three of us, plus Colin, we'll invite him too, the four of us will figure out a brand new system of government. We would want something where acting in the public interest also is good for your political career. And that way those interests are aligned. The problem is, in recent years, more and more, we have pulled apart those two things so that good policy and good politics have less and less to do with each other than before. And just to give one example of that, Citizens United, which I think everyone knows of, right? This Supreme Court decision that let this flood of money into our politics. One of the most important things it did was it said, if you have more money and you donate more money, you essentially get more votes. You have more say in your government. And what that has done is very naturally, and not just in a sneaky way. I mean, John Roberts literally said this in one of his Supreme Court opinions that followed Citizens United. It has made the interests of a very small number of people who have a ton of money more important than the interests of a very large number of people who have less money. And that is an example where then naturally the policy starts to flow toward the interests of the people who control the politics. And so I think, that idea that good policy is good politics is, we should think of it as a North Star rather than as a truism, because right now, too often it's not true. And I do think, when we're talking about these specific issues, there's no question that in the next, I would say, couple of months, a couple of weeks, couple of months, and then certainly if in November Democrats have a good election night, there's going to have to be this question of, what do we really mean? We know what the problems are, but what do the solutions look like? And that is going to be a really challenging thing. And I think as Democrats, the challenge is going to be, how do we hold ourselves together in that moment? How do we say, yeah, we all can agree that a police officer should not be allowed to murder someone in cold blood. That is obvious. We can all agree that we see these videos on TV of police just beating up protesters, and that's horrifying. But what do we do about it? And that's going to be much more complicated. And the instinct, especially I think the instinct on the left, which is always like 1 second from everyone turning on each other, is going to be to turn on each other. But we have to figure out what are the bounds in which we can say, well, we may not all agree, but this is how we can move forward. We can build coalitions and figure out how to make things better.
I'll take up the part that David wanted to dodge. It's like,
yeah,
which is, this defunding the police question, right? It is a big question. And I think we're seeing right now the Minneapolis City Council, I believe, is in chambers like at this moment considering a proposal to defund the Minneapolis police and to instead channel the funds that have been used to underwrite essentially the killing of Black people. Jamar Clark died before George Floyd. This is not new to Minneapolis. It's certainly not new to any major city or any small city for that matter. And instead use that money to focus on community programs, health services, social work. Is it really necessary for a police officer to go to a convenience store or a grocery store to talk about a counterfeit bill? Like, is there another method of community and public safety that works better than one that was based on the catching and killing of slaves? So I think it's really important that we understand, like, when Black people especially are saying it's time to defund the police, it's not defunding public safety. It's not defunding community safety. It's not defunding our, community well-being. It's actually investing those resources in institutions and in systems and in initiatives that can actually keep people safe and prevent us from getting to points where a George Floyd or an Eric Garner or a Tamir Rice happen.
Yeah, I would just add a few things to that, because I didn't mean to totally dodge the question specifically.
And I didn't mean to suggest you were totally dodging it, David.
No, I half dodged it. That's fair. It's like a slight dodge. But I think it's an important question. I think it's something we should talk about, because I think that there's a few different things that I think are happening simultaneously. One is that this idea of saying defund the police, for as long as I have been thinking about politics, people on the left have said, we don't have good bumper sticker slogans. And I do think the left has gotten much better at coming up with catchy phrases that people can all agree on. But we saw this during the primary with Medicare for All, where when you ask people, are you for Medicare for All? People said, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And then when you ask people about the specifics of it, people were not in nearly as much agreement. And so figuring out what that actually means and what actually has popular support is going to be more difficult. And also figuring out, and this is where I think it's so important to have both local elections and local leaders taking point on this, because I think what Minneapolis is doing is really interesting. And also, if you look at the state of their police force, clearly it's a mess and it's putting people at risk. So they're going to have to say, this isn't working, but we can't replace it with nothing. We have to figure out some way to do public safety. So how do we do it? And we allow our states and cities to become laboratories of democracy again. And I think that's really important, rather than just focus on the federal level. Because on the federal level, it's the hardest to make change, and it's the hardest to fix things if it turns out that the policy you think might work didn't actually work the way you wanted it to. The one other thing I would add is that these problems are so connected, and you start to tug on one thread of the sweater and you realize that like everything is really woven together. So for example, one of the reasons we have to rely, or at least we feel or have felt so much that we have to rely on police to do jobs that police should not be doing, is that in America, we have gun laws where basically, everyone gets a gun, and if they want one in a lot of states. And so you have police responding to calls because, you know, if you pull someone over for a traffic stop, for example, where these things escalate, part of that is that police walk up and they say, wait a second, it's America. That person could be carrying a gun. And that makes everything more potentially violent. There's just all this potential for violence on both sides. So one of the ways to reduce the need for aggressive policing and potentially for policing in general is to do something about gun laws. But one of the reasons we can't do something about gun laws is that states that have the highest rate of gun ownership have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, because the Senate favors small and rural states over big urban states. So these things all come back to each other, and they all, to me, come back to the same, not necessarily the same answer, but the answer all has something to do with we have to have a structure that allows us to make the kind of change we want to make. If we have a structure, the way we've been doing things, where we all agree a change is necessary, but you can't do anything about it, ultimately we're just going to be disappointed. And also, you know, in many cases, it's not just a matter of disappointment. We're learning that this is a life or death issue for a lot of people.
You kind of touched on this a little bit, David, but how does Vice President Biden kind of break this down a little more so it doesn't just become this, you know, I think President Trump is pretty good at sort of branding and making things kind of bite-sized for the American public. How does Vice President Biden sort of combat that and explain to people that it's not, you know, going to further divide people, that it's, and I'll stop there, but how does he do that?
So I think, you know, I remember looking at polls and some focus groups and whatnot 6 months ago, and I think there was this challenge for Democrats of saying the economy is doing very well, but the president is erratic and everybody is a little bit worried about him because he's a maniac and, you know, racist and a variety of other bad things, seems to commit crimes at a slightly higher rate than other presidents, a variety of things we don't really look for in a president. But on the other hand, the economy's good. And, you know, everyone's been warning that something terrible will happen if Trump gets elected, and the terrible thing has not happened yet. I don't think it's a good thing that all this terrible stuff happened, but I do think it's a good thing that it happened before rather than after we have an election where we can decide whether or not to hold the president accountable. You know, I think that is important. And I think it's a good thing that Democrats aren't going to have to go into November saying, hey, this guy is going to bungle a crisis, but don't have any proof. At the very least, at this point, we now have very clear proof that when these enormous crises have occurred, and we've now had two of them in pretty rapid succession, President Trump's attitude was just a complete failure. So I think that Vice President Biden, hopefully, in my mind, President Biden soon, but I think that his, you know, as much as he can get this basic question to the old Reagan question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? I mean, the number of Americans who are going to be able to answer yes to that question is small. And, you know, there was some slightly better economic news yesterday, but that's small and getting smaller. And particularly when, you know, state and local governments get hit hard and unemployment money starts to run out. I mean, you know, it would be great if we had a president who could fix these things so they weren't election issues. But the good thing about a democracy is that if the president can't fix these things, they become election issues.
Gina, what do you think about that?
I think David's spot on. Listen, people who work with me have been getting tired of me hearing, we're getting tired of me saying that in terms of like who we speak to, and it goes back to this question of the electorate, David, like who the voters are. I believe personally that the road to the White House goes to the South, and that if Democrats could really get behind actually investing in Black and brown voters in the South and spending the money on a ground game in places like, when I'm in South Carolina, right? So I'm talking about going to the Black voters in Marlborough County and Jasper County. I know that if we do the math, we can get the votes to win at state and local level. It is a more expensive proposition to get those voters in the South than it is to get the mythical white voter who will save us in the Rust Belt. And so for me, I'm thinking I want there to be a President Biden, and also I believe it's going to happen with actual investing in Black people, brown people in the South, in places that we might not normally have thought we needed to. But that feels really important to me and goes back to David's point about local and state elections, like who's running there and how are we lifting those people up too, as well as VP Biden. Like we need to be able to walk into bubblegum and really like lifting up the vision that Biden has for the country, and also lifting up the people who are going to be able to be his foot soldiers in the states.
David, you traveled the country for how long? 2.5 years?
Well, I would say I did less traveling the country. Originally, I thought this was going to be a travel book. And then my editor, perhaps because she knows much more about what makes a good book than I do, this is only my second, kept saying, is that really necessary? So there's some travel. And, I did a little travel for 2.5 years. And at one point I traveled to Iceland as well to learn about Viking democracy, but sadly that didn't make it into the book.
I love that. Charging your publisher for going to Iceland, maybe?
No, I think know how this is, but it was, I guess, technically a business trip, but sadly, the publisher was not like, the publisher was like, if you want to go to Iceland, you can go to Iceland. But this is just a total tangent, but I feel like every so often these days we need one. It is absolutely fascinating that around like the year 1000 or so, these Vikings in Iceland were, they were going abroad, they were marauding and pillaging, and then they would come home and they had one of the most functional democracies of any other country in the world for about 200 or 300 years. Such an interesting experiment in democracy that in the 70s, libertarians in the US used to point to Icelandic democracy in the time of the Vikings as like the best way to run a government. And they were wrong for a variety of reasons. But I just thought it was totally fascinating that you had these Vikings who spent most of their time murdering people, but then sometimes we're like, okay, let's get together and like really think through, the intricacies of our legal system and our election.
It's interesting. So what did you learn when you were on our home turf, when you did travel in the United States? What was the biggest lesson that can be applied today?
I think one of the most important things that I learned was how different elections are in place to place. I mean, I learned something very inspiring, which is, and this was intentional. I went and I met with, and spent a day with Shelley Simons, who is, she was a high school or middle school Spanish teacher in Newport News, Virginia, and she decided to run for office, and she ran twice, and the first time she lost by quite a bit, and the second time her race was actually tied, literally, same number of votes on both sides. And then the third time she won, and she's now a delegate in Virginia representing her hometown. And that was a really cool experience. I mean, those are the kind of things that just give you faith in our country, because this was somebody who said, I'm looking around and we could do better and I could be part of it. And I met with people and I accompanied them on a voter registration drive in Texas and saw how hard it is to register voters, but also how hard people are working to overcome a system that was designed to make registration difficult. But one of the most fascinating things about all of this is to Ginna's point about 50 state elections. Because our election laws are really decided at the state level, elections look very different in different places. And so the more you go around the country, the more you see a lot of similarities culturally. There's a lot of basic ideas that people have about how elections run, but the specifics about what happens on election day, the mechanics of voting, who has power and who doesn't, those are often really different. And it made it interesting, but also kind of complicated to keep track of.
So what would you say that, was there a moment that kind of made you say, this is interesting. I never knew about this.
Yeah, I mean, this was one where I'll go back to Texas for a second. So I went to Houston and I was part of this voter registration drive, and they had to go through at the beginning of voter registration drive. And I should say I've registered, a pretty good number of voters in a variety of jobs, right? I was a field organizer for Obama in Ohio. I spent time back in Ohio in 2012. I was in Florida in 2016. So I've registered a lot of voters. I have never experienced a registration drive where everyone has to get together and talk about all the different ways that you could break the law just by trying to register someone to vote. And in Texas, I mean, there's so many different ways you can become a criminal just registering to vote. And I think for me, the moment that really hit home was somebody said, if I hand my voter registration form to anybody, that person is committing a crime. And I said, well, like, for example, like, you know, if I'm walking with you and you need to tie your shoe and you're holding a form and you hand it to me, they're like, yeah, that's a criminal act in Texas, technically at least. And so the ways that our laws have been constructed so often to keep people out of the electorate, to keep people from voting rather than to help people vote, is really remarkable. But the flip side of that is that there's a really easy answer to a lot of problems, which is reverse that, right? Replace them with laws that are about bringing people in rather than keeping people out.
What about, I know you've been involved heavily with getting young people involved. Vice President Biden, I think, has had some trouble. I think President Obama didn't really have this sort of trouble, and he sort of needs to tap into the so-called Obama coalition to get elected in November. What does he need to do? And you can kind of speak to this also based on the last couple of weeks, but what does he need to do to get them excited and ready to vote for him so he can win in November?
So I will say that this is the kind of thing that, from all the numbers that I've looked at, I think the mainstream media, Amie, that you're part of, the lamestream media, is exaggerates here. I do think that it's separating the narrative from the numbers is a little tricky. But I will say, regardless of the exact numbers, because I'm not on the Biden campaign, I'm not looking at their polling. I'm not looking at anybody's polling in that sense, at least that deeply. No question, if young people voted at higher rates, this would be a different country. Historically, young people have voted in presidential elections. I think it's somewhere around 50%, might be even less, 40, 50%. That's a remarkably low number. And if that number, it doesn't have to be, like, this is one thing that we often miss. The question is not, how do we get 100% of young people to vote, although that would be great. If we could get 50% of young people to vote, that would be a dismal number, but it would still completely transform the country. If we get 60% of young people to vote, that would be extraordinary. And I think that there's two pieces to that. So one is, again, the urgency of the moment, and Ginna, to your point, this idea of elevating not just Biden, but the people around him, right? I don't think that Biden, he's not the candidate that most young people were the most excited about by any means. But I think that he is part of a party that has lots of people that excite young people, and he can be building that coalition, not just once he's president, but before that, to make it clear that he's not just bringing himself into the White House, but he's bringing in all of these other people, many of whom have really inspired young people in a different way. The other thing is just practical. So many of our rules, especially around registration, and I keep coming back to this, are designed to make it hard to do things at the last minute. And young people, and I will say this as still a quasi-young person, and someone who still loves to do things at the last minute, love to do things at the last minute. And so the more that young people start to organize each other, the more they start to say, get registered, don't wait till the deadline to get registered. It's just a thing that you do. The more that young people check their own registration, because in many, many cases, you think you're registered and you're not. I mean, when I was writing this book, I checked my registration just as a kind of like, well, I might as well. And I live in DC, so my vote doesn't matter anyway. But, in theory, I checked my registration, and it turned out I was registered at the wrong address. I was registered at my old address and hadn't re-registered, and I needed to. And in some states, that could cost me my vote. So all of these things put together, on one hand, part of a big coalition. On the other hand, how do you make sure that young people are organizing themselves to get to the polls?
Ginna, do you want to add to that?
I don't think I need to. David handled that masterfully. I think the one thing that I might say is just that, and you reference this in the book, is that young people are included in that group of folks who, if they vote for Democrats, right? So like when you're talking about who has been on the losing end of the last 30 years of disenfranchisement, yes, a lot of Black people, and then poor people, young people, immigrants, there is that they are part of that group. And a lot of the efforts that we've seen in the last couple of years to try and disenfranchise college students in various states across the country, like actively, there's a reason. And so, to David's point about like having the young people get each other seems like a really sound strategy in the midst of what we know is active disenfranchisement.
Can I just
do you think that the last couple of weeks helped this effort?
Ginna?
Why don't you take it, since we're going to say something else? You do both at the same time.
Well, I'll do the, so what I wanted to just say was an interesting example of this. And again, that's interesting, the euphemism. But when, so here in Florida, for example, they passed a law that said you can have an early voting site in a variety of places, a very wide variety of places, but you cannot have early voting take place on a college campus. And they specifically excluded college campuses. There was no particular reason for it. They just said not allowed. So then they got sued, right? Young, college students sued Florida, and that law was overturned because there was no good basis for excluding college campuses. So Florida came back, and this is how intense the effort is to keep certain people from voting. So Florida came back and said, well, you need, any early voting site needs to have a certain amount of public parking. And because college campuses are one of the only places where there's a lot of parking, but it's not public parking, you have to have a permit. That was a way of saying, okay, that's our way of keeping early voting from taking place at college campuses. Now, one of the things that I will say, I saw as an organizer, and I've certainly seen just in politics, is in particular in the Black community, there has been a long effort over decades to say the right to vote is something we fought really hard for. And also, if people keep trying to take it away, maybe that's a sign that our votes are really important. And I do think that among young voters, hopefully that same kind of understanding starts to seep into the culture of saying, man, there are a lot of people who are working really, really hard to keep people like us from voting. Maybe that means that we have a lot of power, or we would if we voted. And I think that is, that certainly could happen. I think that's quite possible. And to your point, Amie, I do think the last few weeks, it is always difficult to make people feel the stakes of an election. And it's always very easy to say this is the most important election of our lifetimes. I don't think anybody wonders whether the stakes are high in this election. Some people are skeptical of Biden, but I think between, and I think we're now at over 110,000 Americans who've already lost their lives because of coronavirus, plus all of the unrest and chaos we're seeing in the streets, and a president who is just on the wrong side of all of it. I don't think it's very hard to say, yeah, this stuff is really important. Your vote really matters, and this choice really matters.
Sorry. Go ahead.
And I think, though, that what might be pushing, and part of the push for young people in this moment, in these last 12 days, is that their votes are important, and so is their voice. And both of those are key, because the change that we have seen, the Overton window getting smashed, has been a result of voice and protest and presence and visibility. And I think that there's been, so both of those things are happening at the same time. They're realizing, oh, wait, actually we can get things done. And even as we move policy, there's still channels, elected bodies that actually have to take that and make it into something. So I think that there's a recognition happening that change is actually possible.
Yeah, I agree with that.
David, I wanted to get into a little bit of your book and some of the funny anecdotes. Why did you decide to go to Mitch McConnell's fraternity? What was the rationale there?
So I have been obsessed with Mitch McConnell for a long time. I have to say, I think I was into.
Why? I have to ask.
Cool. The reason is, when I was in the Obama White House, obviously I was not, making all the decisions or anything, but I was kind of watching from the inside, even if it was not as an important person. And over again, it felt like Mitch McConnell understood something that the rest of his party, and sometimes that my fellow Democrats, did not. He just had a sense of, here's how the system works. And ultimately, if you know where all the levers are and you know how the machine works, it doesn't matter if popular opinion is not on your side. He was very good at figuring out how to just make the math insurmountable, even when the narrative did not fit what he wanted it to fit. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about words rather than numbers, I could see how effective that was. And I don't think that Mitch McConnell is a genius, and he certainly didn't win every fight, but he has this understanding of the difference between politics and other competitions is that in politics, the players can rewrite the rules. And that, I think, has really changed our country. So I felt like when I started this book, and I wasn't really sure how to get started, In the same way that if I wanted to write a book about the Beatles and I didn't know where to start, I might go to Abbey Road. I was like, I need to find some Mitch McConnell, national treasure style secret. And so I went to Louisville and I tried to crash a frat party at Phi Tau, which is Mitch McConnell's former or current, but old fraternity. It did not work. It turns out that crashing a frat party when you're in your 30s is a very different experience than trying to crash a frat party only a few years prior. But I went back and I tried again. And the crazy thing that I learned, while I did not get in and find any Mitch McConnell secrets, is that at the University of Louisville, there is a rumor that nearly everyone I talk to believes that Mitch McConnell literally owns the land underneath the frat house. And I have no idea if this is true, but I just thought it was remarkable that even on a campus, there is this sense that like Mitch McConnell and his buddies play by one set of rules and everybody else plays by a very different set of rules. And I'm worried about what happens if that understanding and that resignation just gets locked in to a new generation from a really early age.
Was there anyone else that sort of piqued your interest while you were at the White House?
Well, I mean, plenty of people, but not the same as, I don't know. I've spent like a lot of time thinking about Mitch McConnell. He's the one I keep coming back to. And again, not because I think he's single-handedly responsible for this. I think it's actually really important. I talked to Sarah Binder, who's a professor at GW at George Washington University in DC. And she read the chapter I wrote about the Senate. And she said, overall seems good. You didn't mess up any facts too badly, which was great. But she said, you should mention that Mitch McConnell could not do all of this stuff that he's done to the country if his allies in Congress were not also supportive of it. That in the Senate, ultimately he has more power than Senate majority leaders have in the past historically, but senators still have a lot of power. If just a couple of senators said, we won't stand for this, he would not be nearly as successful at it. So this is him leading the way, but he's kind of both a product, he's a symptom and a cause of the political moment that he's in.
Do you think, sorry, I'm having a bit of a technical problem. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yeah, okay, I'm back. Why did you feel like, you talked about Schoolhouse Rock a little earlier. We sort of grew up on that. There are other people, you mentioned this intern that you talked to who had no idea what Schoolhouse Rock was about. Why did you kind of have this urge to kind of break this down, to make politics a little more bite-sized and relatable? Like can you kind of explain this process for us?
Yeah, the way that I felt about it was I started thinking about this and I realized like I understand how my democracy works roughly the same way I understand how my car works. Like when everything is going well, I know how to drive and I know how to, I know what to do. But when it breaks down, I have literally no idea. I mean, I'm a city kid, right? Like I don't know how the car works. And that seems relatively fine. I can take it into the shop. But in a democracy, citizens of a democracy, the residents of a democracy ought to understand, how to do their own DIY repairs. And I didn't. And I felt like I wanted to write something that helped people understand that without having to read tons of political science, frankly, without reading books that are super depressing, because so many of the books about democracy right now, understandably, are not terribly upbeat. And I wanted to talk about this in a way that is real and honest, but also optimistic, at least in the long term, about where we're headed, or at least where we could be headed. And the other thing that I was really stunned by with Schoolhouse Rock in particular was, I grew up on this idea that fundamentally, if we the people have a thought, right? For those of you who don't remember it, right? There's the song about Bill. I will not sing, but he's sitting on the Capitol steps, and he started off as an idea, and then he goes through the legislative process, and he's signed into law. And it's this idea: if we have an idea and we get people to agree with it, then we can change. We can change what our government does. And that idea is really in peril right now, in part because of what is called veto points. So this is, a political science term, but basically it just means like anything a bill has to get through, and if it doesn't get past that bridge, it dies. And there are veto points that did not exist when Bill was trying to become a law in Schoolhouse Rock. Just to give you one example here, the amount of money spent on lobbying Congress since 2000 has more than doubled. So that's not like, history. That's in recent history. The amount of money spent lobbying Congress has more than doubled. And now the amount of money spent lobbying Congress is more money than we as taxpayers spend on Congress itself, on the staff, on the research service, on all of that. So most people who make policy in Washington today are paid by someone who is not us. They're paid by a private interest. And the influence industry has become a veto point for legislation in a way it was not in the 1970s when Schoolhouse Rock was first debuting. So those are the kind of things I keep coming back to, that when you look at the structure, it really explains so much about what we see in the country.
Should we open it up to questions, Colin?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Oh, I'm not Colin.
I'm actually going to take host privilege and throw in the first question, if I may. And then folks out there, if you want to start posting questions in the chat, I'll try to kind of curate questions that are similar. I've already gotten a number, and I'll share them with the group. So I guess I'm trying to be really hopeful, and overall this conversation has added to my hopeful fuel. So thank you. But I'm also having a sense memory of two things that give me pause. One is relying on the question, are you better off or worse off than you were 4 years ago? And while surely many people are not better off, at least technically speaking, or very much technically speaking, and in lots of ways, there are a lot of folks, I would put myself in this bucket, that on paper, and if I'm just looking at the economy or like my job, I am actually better off than I was 4 years ago. I wasn't working at BJ then, and I love this job. I love this community. I have to be really connected with my privilege and all of the things that don't affect me but that I care about in order to answer that question the right way. So that's one piece that I'm thinking about, and it's not so much about the system, but it's about how we orient ourselves and how we campaign. And the other piece is I recall how many folks, I think a lot of them were the Bernie bro types, who basically said it's the same difference between Hillary and Trump, like it was Bernie or bust. And so while, David, you spoke about, Trump has failed twice on these two big things, there are those who would say, well, I don't think Hillary would do any better. What's his face in the Times yesterday? He literally said, I don't think Hillary would have done any better on the pandemic. And I'm like, Bret Stephens. And I'm like, how can you say that? But there are people who are going to hold that. So, for all three of you, do we campaign differently for those people, or do we ignore those people and focus on getting different people to the polls? How do we navigate this?
Well, can I just jump in and say, I feel like, Amie, we have not gotten to ask you any questions, and I'm curious, obviously you're not a partisan, you're a reporter, but I am curious about, how do you, particularly, you asked me a little bit about this, but yeah, do you feel like Biden is in trouble consolidating the party? I often confuse what I hope will happen with what I think will happen. So I'm curious what your take on this is.
I was less, if you asked me this question a month ago, I would have said the party needs a lot of help mostly because I think a lot of people in the party still felt a little bit like he won the primary and he was a little lucky. The Times, Donald Trump, everything kind of converged onto this moment. People thought he was the most electable, but there was this concern, I think, a palpable concern that he could still lose this thing because, for a number of reasons, because Donald Trump brands him as this guy who, is forgetful and sleepy, and for the most part, his branding works. Even Democrats don't want to admit it, but, I talked to a few of my friends in Florida who aren't avid politicos as we all are. And I'm from Florida, and I'm always curious about how they feel. And, a lot of them were concerned about him not being, of course, they felt like he had the experience, but they were worried about this whole idea of him being kind of senile and not, up to the task of being president, and the fact that he would only be serving for 4 years, and what did that say? And so, but I think things have changed. I felt kind of a palpable change in the last couple of weeks as I talked to Democrats. I feel like the Democrats who were kind of hesitant to support him, they kind of feel like this is our moment, get in line. We don't have any other choice. They saw what happened in terms of that photo op moment, and that was very concerning to them the other day. So I do feel like things have changed. And that, I think, will propel Biden to the presidency. I do think that he is the favorite right now. And it's funny, I wrote a story this weekend. Well, how does he remain the favorite? And I think that remains to be seen. And whether he kind of comes out of the basement and speaks to people, goes to Minneapolis, is on the ground, and Democrats kind of feel that passion. I feel like if he does all of those things, then he has this, and you can kind of take it to the bank and he'll be president. So I do think that there has been a shift, if that answers your question. I don't know, Ginna, if you'd like to weigh in on this as well.
I mean, just to agree with you and say that I think that there has been that shift. I know and love plenty of people who were not super excited about a Biden candidacy, and we're like, okay, we got to do what we got to do. I think that proportion of people has grown, and that is a good thing. Colin, I think I found your question really, really interesting because of what it actually meant, right? You're saying that answering the question of how am I better off than I was 4 years ago, it fundamentally takes us out of we are connected, that my liberation is bound up with yours, and that we're all responsible for each other. I totally appreciate that and where you were going. And people historically vote out of self-interest. Like that is like a thing that is like a lot of times core for people in voting is that question. And that's why Reagan answered it asked it so eloquently, right? It's because that is true. I think that as we as a country are reckoning with some of the cracks in our foundation and reckoning with the reality that we haven't really built a place where we all can thrive, that self-interested motivation in the voting booth is going to change and will change. And I think people will be thinking about what does this decision not just mean for me, but what does it mean for my community? I think that time is coming.
Baruch Hashem, as we like to say. All right, some questions from the audience. So earlier, fairly early on, you guys were talking about, or David, you spoke about the fact that some legislative changes at the federal level could make a big difference. And the question was asked, why didn't Obama do that in his first 2 years when he had Congress as well? Why didn't they make a big move then when they had the opportunity?
There's three I can put my finger on, although I was not there in the first 2 years. So I'm not saying this as as an insider in any way. One is there was an economic crisis. And I think one of the challenges, and Amie, I would just say, as a Democrat, I very much hope that Biden if Biden becomes the odds-on favorite and everyone agrees he's the favorite, nothing could be worse for his actual odds of becoming president. I feel like it's never good to be clearly the front runner. So I hope that I hope that Biden continues to sort of figure out, as long as this current mode of he's up in the polls, but everyone keeps wondering what he's doing in the basement, I think actually works very well for him. Because it gives people a thing to focus on that isn't actually a serious vulnerability. But I think that, let's assume for a second that Biden does win and Democrats can do stuff. The question is going to be, how do we focus on both the urgent and the important simultaneously? So we are going to be taking power in the middle of a crisis, probably several crises, but we also have to think about the foundation issues. It's the same way that if you moved into a house and the foundation is cracked, you can't start rebuilding and not think about your foundation. You have to do both at least. Or I would say, frankly, you do the foundation first, and you can do it quickly. You don't have to wait, but you have to do the foundation stuff, even though it's not as sexy, it's not as exciting necessarily. Doing it ultimately is very effective. That's what Mitch MCConnell understood so well, and it's what Democrats are just now beginning to understand. And hopefully this book will help make people get that understanding a little better. The other two things I would say. So number one, I do think that there was an element where, for example, on DC statehood, Democrats dropped the ball a little bit. I don't remember the exact details of the fight, but there was this big fight over DC statehood. I think the reason that we didn't end up doing it was because of a pro-gun amendment that got attached to something else early on. And I would say very few things are as important as DC statehood. And I don't just say this because I live in DC. I say it because adding 2 senators who come from a majority non-white state, and DC would be the only majority non-white state other than Hawaii, would be an important way to at least begin to correct the imbalance of power in the Senate. And that leads me directly to my third thing, which is one of the most important dynamics in American politics, and something that I did not understand before I started doing research for this book, and I would say most Americans don't think about, is that states are much more conservative than people. What I mean by that is Donald Trump won 30 states to Clinton's 20. So he won the states by a 20% margin. He lost the popular vote by about a 2% margin. So states were 22% more red than people. And to get to 60 votes in the Senate, which is where Obama briefly had a window where Democrats could theoretically do whatever they wanted, that 60th vote is going to come from a state that is much more conservative than America. So even if a Democrat is representing that state, they're going to be more conservative, certainly than most Democrats and probably than most Americans. And that's not true for Republicans. It's an uneven way that the Senate works. So that's just a challenge we need to get past. One of the ways to do it, by the way, would be to get rid of the filibuster for legislation so that you only needed 50 votes to pass a bill.
What about getting rid of the Senate, David?
I mean, the thing about getting rid of the Senate is I don't think the Senate serves a particularly valuable purpose. Actually, let me back up on that. I think the Senate serves a valuable purpose. I don't think that the way the Senate is constructed serves a valuable purpose. But one of the things about the Senate is that the structure of the Senate, where every state gets 2 votes, is one of the only things, I think it's actually the only thing in the Constitution, where they said, this is not up for amendment. You cannot amend the Senate to say New York should get more senators than Wyoming, even though New York has so many more people than Wyoming. It's just not allowed. The only way you could change that is to rip up the entire Constitution and start from scratch. So one of the things I've tried to focus on in the book, and as I think about this, is what are the things we really can do, right? We can't get rid of the Senate as it currently functions, even though in many ways it is really hurting our country. But there's lots of things we can do that will mitigate the harm that has happened.
Could we switch some of the things, like could we take the power to, say, the select Supreme Court and give that to Congress so it is representational? That's
a really good question. I assume that the answer to that would be yes. I think the Senate's powers are laid out in one section of the Constitution, but it's not specifically immune to amendment. I don't think that's going to happen, just to be really clear. Like, I tried to focus on stuff that will not take a constitutional amendment because, again, constitutional amendments take states. They take a supermajority of states to pass. And when states are more conservative than people, constitutional amendments are much less likely to pass than legislation.
So, David, just to follow up on you brought up DC statehood. Someone actually asked about changing or eliminating the Electoral College, and also about statehood for Puerto Rico as well as DC. So can you just sort of expand a bit, you and Ginna and Amie, on that bigger idea?
Yeah, I'll try to just be really quick. So I do talk about Puerto Rico and statehood. I think DC is different because in DC we pay a ton of federal taxes and we don't have any representation in Congress. It's literally taxation without representation. Puerto Rico, I think, should be up to Puerto Ricans and they should decide whether they want to be a state. I have my own view, which is that I think it would be great if Puerto Rico joined the Union, but I don't think that it's, I think that, in other words, like Mitch McConnell has said, he really thinks Puerto Rico should not be a state. I'm fine taking sides on that, but I think the ultimate decision should be up to Puerto Ricans. And then when it comes to the Electoral College, I go through all the reasons in the book, but what's remarkable about the Electoral College is it's just dumb. Like, I really try to be, thoughtful and careful about things and look at both sides of every issue. The Electoral College is really stupid. There's no reason we should have it. And, I go into all the reasons why that is, but what's remarkable about it is, like, if someone tells you the Electoral College is a good idea, they're wrong. And I would not say that about most things. Most things are complicated.
Give us the Cliff Notes version of why, though. I mean, I know you talk about this a lot in the book, but why? Why is it dumb?
So the Cliff Notes version is the reason that I learned we have the Electoral College is that it helps small states, the same way that we have the Senate with 2 senators per state. But big states still have so many more electors than small states because most of it is based on representatives, which is based on population. Right? You get 1 elector for every representative and then 1 for every senator. So California has 55 electoral votes, Wyoming has just 3, and because they're winner take all, California is way more important than Wyoming. So if the idea of the Electoral College was to keep small states from getting overlooked, then it's not working. And sometimes you hear people say that rural states benefit from the Electoral College. And Amie, I don't know where, oh, there you disappeared and are back.
Sure.
But you sometimes hear that rural states benefit from the Electoral College, and that's actually not true. Like, for example, if you live in Vermont, which is a rural state, or Arkansas, which is a rural state, presidential candidates do not care about you. You know, I guess, Amie, you're probably not doing a lot of traveling for the new book, but if you were, you would not be going to Vermont or Arkansas. They're just not competitive. The only thing that matters because of the Electoral College are the swing states. And the number of swing states has gone down as America's gotten more polarized. So fewer of us cast votes that really matter for president. And also they don't even benefit one party consistently over time. So Trump has some Electoral College advantage, probably. It seems to be shrinking in recent polls, but I think most likely. Obama had an Electoral College advantage in 2012. He could have lost the popular vote and he still would have become president. So the Electoral College, the way I describe it is it's just like playing a game of Russian roulette. Like most of the time, nothing happens. And then every so often you get this huge mess that someone else has to clean up. But there's no good reason to do it.
What about term? Before, sorry, Colin, but what about, I always get questions about term limits. What about, why does the president have a term limit and why not members of Congress? And how does that affect things?
So I actually, term limits for Congress, for members of Congress, are one of those ideas that seem like a really good government reform, but would actually backfire really badly. And the reason for that, and I think most political scientists would agree with that. And the biggest reason I think is when you take power, first of all, I'm in favor of voters deciding to term limit people in Congress, which they do all the time, right? You always see ads that say, this person is out of touch, they spent too much time in DC, you know, replace them with someone young and new. And that is a form of term limiting. People are saying, you've been in power for too long, we're replacing you. The voters should be able to decide. But to have a system where you can't serve past a certain amount of time means that members of Congress wouldn't have the institutional knowledge just about how lawmaking works, how the different interest groups in DC are functioning, about building coalitions. And that knowledge wouldn't go away, it would just go to the private sector. So then you have a term-limited member of Congress who becomes a lobbyist and starts lobbying their new colleagues who don't really know how the place works. Or, you know, maybe they don't become a lobbyist, but the interest groups are there and they don't have term limits. And so the question when you're taking power away from someone, I think, is always, power is kind of like I think of it as, you know, it's like it's a finite resource, right? If you're taking power away from one group, where is it going? It's like, you know, air in a balloon or something. And so if you kind of like take power away from elected members of Congress via term limits, power is going to unelected policymakers because then they're still in power year after year after year. So that's kind of long way of answering that question. But I actually think term limits are one of those reforms that actually would backfire rather than go well.
I'm going to put 2 questions together. One is sort of simple, which is how important are absentee ballots? You know, are they always included in the final count, or what are the sort of, how do they work? And then in terms of strategy, someone asked which of the most important demographic for Democrats to win over and get out the vote, minorities, progressive, independent, how would you focus or I guess recommend to folks listening, watching, if they were to put some effort out there, whom should they focus on? And I would put that to all 3 of you.
Ginna, do you want to answer? I feel like I've just talked for a long time, so.
I mean, well, interesting. That's a good question. So the absentee ballot question, like David was saying, like we've said, elections are run differently. Like there are 50 states and more than 3,000 jurisdictions who run elections and are processing these absentee ballots. So, you know, they do get counted. They're not always counted by the night of election day or night because they just can't. People are still turning them in on that day, right? So there is that. So, but we do know absentee ballots get counted, and if they ultimately change the outcome of the election, then they change the outcome of the election. So vote, get your mail-in ballot, and make that request, and do it if you can. In terms of who we need to reach, I've actually already answered this question. I feel like Black people, Black women, Black folks in the South are incredibly important to this election, I feel like, and really investing in that community is super important. I think Democrats also need to do a little bit of a better job with the Latino community too. And that's got to be also in the many Southern states and in the Southwest, right? Very important. This is coming from sort of my experience working at statewide organizations in the South and just us doing the math. I will never forget being in the office of the South Carolina Progressive Network and Brent Bursey pulling out the numbers. They'd done the Missing Voter Project around Nikki Haley's race when her first gubernatorial race, when she was running against Vince Shaheen, a Democrat, awesome state senator at the time. And he's running me through the numbers. And it's like, Nikki Haley didn't have to win. We actually left that election on the table. Like we just gave it away. We actually had the votes, we had the people, but we didn't invest in the right people to make the right vote for us to have won that election. And so that to me is just an object lesson in what it actually means to be in community, reaching communities, and talking to all of us. And I think that really reaching into Black and Brown communities is going to be really important for 2020.
Right. Someone asked the damage. You talked about this a bit, with what Citizens United did, and David, I know you talk about that a lot in the book. At this point, if it was reversed, repealed, what kind of difference would it make? How quickly should that be something we focus on?
So getting rid of Citizens United would make an enormous difference. I just don't think it's going to happen. And the reason I don't think it's going to happen is that with a pretty entrenched conservative court majority, and that could change if we expand the Supreme Court, which I think we should, but it is ultimately pretty difficult to imagine a future where the court is very quickly overturning its own decision, and a constitutional amendment is not going to happen because too many Republican politicians feel like their electoral fortunes depend on campaign finance laws having been shredded. So to me, the things to think about are the way I think about it is how do you make buying votes via political donations a less valuable proposition? How do you increase the cost by having tougher disclosure laws, tougher transparency laws? And then also, how do you give the rest of us some power? A good example of this is in Seattle, you get what's called a democracy bond. It's like a $25 gift card, and you can spend it on a candidate. You can donate it to a candidate or a political organization, or you can say, I don't want to do this at all, and the money goes back to the Treasury. But it's a way of restoring power. I forget the total amount, but it's millions and millions of dollars when you add it up that go to small donors rather than big ones. And so it's just a way of trying to level the playing field. So I think that would have an enormous impact as well. The biggest thing, obviously, would be to get rid of Citizens United. But I think that the odds of that happening are not super high. On the other hand, I think I did have something in the book where I wrote, well, a lot of states are doing vote by mail, but I don't see that being a big thing we're all talking about by the time this book comes out, so it's a footnote. So I've been wrong before. I've been wrong quite a bit.
I want to plus one the democracy vouchers in Seattle, just because what makes that, it's not just money in politics and changing whose money it is, but it actually changes who runs and who gets elected. So there are many people of color candidates in places like Seattle, in New Mexico, which also had a Democracy Dollars proposal, who cannot run, who can't afford to run unless it's in a publicly financed scenario such as Democracy Dollars. So we're not just like changing who's got the money, but we're actually changing who's running and who's winning when we decide that like elections are public goods. and they deserve public dollars and our support in that way too.
So someone asked, and sort of a build upon this, about the challenge of, I guess, like the old guard in terms of the Democratic leadership, and the transitioning to the new. And part of what that strategy would do is it would take away the power of incumbency even within the party. For example, Pelosi supporting Engel when AOC supporting his, those who were primarying Engel, and basically, as if the party's going to change to more reflect the expansion of people who are participating in it, because we are doing the things we've been talking about. How do we deal with old guard versus new guard? So
I have thoughts, but mostly I actually want to hear what Amie has to say about that. But first, just because we've been doing questions for a while, and I feel like this is always the time when people start to drop off the Zoom a little bit for totally understandable reasons. Do you mind if I just want to explicitly make a book plug, if that's okay?
Sure.
This whole thing is like an implicit book plug, but I feel like this is a safe space for me in this particular.
Yes.
So I just do want to say, if you found this interesting, I would super appreciate it if you pre-ordered the book, if you haven't already. I know many of you have. And the reason for that is that, as you might imagine, introducing a book in a pandemic is not easy. It's not ideal, but pre-orders, and the reason we're doing this now is that even just like a couple of dozen more orders, they help publishers realize like, oh, people are actually interested in this book. So, now is a very useful time if you think these ideas are important, or you just happen to like me personally, or you're related to me, and you want to support the book. And the other thing I will say is that all of the, and Colin mentioned this, all the royalties I get pre-order, I'm donating to Run for Something, which is helping first-time candidates, a really diverse, awesome group of first-time candidates run. And so it's also a chance to, help support a good cause at the same time. So hopefully, if you've enjoyed this, you will go ahead and go to either bookshop.org, which is awesome. You can buy from a local bookstore directly online, or you can just go to davidlittbooks.com and get the book. Okay.
And I just posted all those links. I just posted all those links in the chat.
All right. So I'm finished selling. I won't do that again. Instead, I will just kick your question over to Amie and say, as a Democrat, I think about this constantly I'm so excited by the changes that we're seeing. I'm excited by this new generation of activists, but I feel like if there's one thing Democrats are great at, it's tearing our own party apart. I'm curious whether you think there's hope for us.
It's good for reporters, I should say. We love the we love all of that, and I don't know. I used to write at Politico, and we love the parlor intrigue, as we call it, and that's sort of the name of the game these days. But I should say, what Bernie Sanders was able to do, I think, in terms of, and to Gina's point, I think he was really able to tap into the Latino community. He did like a really great on the ground effort in Nevada, where he was able to really speak to people there. And I think that was really groundbreaking. I think that the Democratic Party obviously has a lot of work to do in terms of, and this will continue even if Joe Biden wins in November, but has a lot of work to do to make it the big tent that they think that they are. I think that a lot of people still feel like they're not included in that big tent. I think in 2016, that was part of the problem, when there were polls done after where African-American men didn't feel like the party was including them. I'm curious to see how that, whether or not that remains to be, whether or not that's the same this time around. And so I think that it'll be interesting to see how the thing that I should say is that I've stopped predicting how things will go. And that's sort of why I'm hesitating here, because in 2016, I thought, like a lot of other people thought, that Hillary Clinton would win this thing and that she would be sitting in the Oval Office. And that taught me a huge lesson to stop predicting. But I'm curious to see how the party kind of comes together and how it's able to solve its differences on both wings.
Oh, you're on mute,
Colin, you're muted.
Thank you. thank you, David and Ginna and Amie, for sharing tons of really insightful, thoughtful, provocative stuff for us to chew on. I highly recommend the book. It is both funny and maddening as you read about all the things that have gone wrong, intentionally and otherwise, but also hopeful in terms of giving us some ideas about how to move forward. I'm going to share a couple things in the link for everybody on related notes. One is that we have an event tomorrow night called on voter engagement with an organization called Reclaim Our Vote. And prior to the event, it's tomorrow night at 5 here on Zoom, there is a video called The Fight to Vote, which was about voter suppression in Georgia. And it's a fascinating half-hour video. And it really brings to life a lot of the history that David brought forth in the book, just sort of, how things have evolved and really devolved from the framers' intentions, both their good intentions and some of their bad intentions. And I think it's really important as those of us who want to really think about how do we do something, where do we put our energies, both of these I think can really help think about that. I think people tuning in and speaking up and sharing is also always great. And with that, I wish everyone a Shavua Tov. For those who have more Zoom energy and would like to join Minyan, BJ's Evening Minyan, it starts at 7 o'clock at another Zoom channel. And our clergy will be there, and delighted to see you all. With that, I wish you all a good night and thanks for joining. And I'm going to open up, unmuting all so people can all say thank you. And
Thank you. Turn everything off and take it out.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
Night.
Everybody. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. Bye.